Oh, hey guys, welcome to the wood shop. Um, I'm gonna show you how to build a door. So already got my pieces made. I ripped them, sanded them, all that stuff. They're down to pretty close to their finished thickness. I cut them to length, and so now I'm ready to router them. So I'm gonna do the ends of the tops and bottoms so that they'll go into the stiles, and then I'll do the edges of all the inside, basically all the inside parts, so my panel will have a place to go. The first thing I do is I look at them and I pick the bad side and put an X on the bad side. Most of the time, depends on the router bit we're using, but most of the time we're going to cut with our bad side up. Okay, so I just put a big X on the bad side. And when I'm looking at that, I'm not only looking at, do I like the look of this or do I like the look of this? I'm also looking at the grain direction. So this one, it's not a terrible one, but the grain kind of slopes down that way. And so what I'm thinking is when I router that and the router bit's curving this way, it's going to be less likely to chip. So if you've got a piece that it's close on, like they both look pretty good, this looks fine, this looks fine, they both look fine, I would try and position it in a way that your grain is going to go basically from right to left. It's going to slope downhill when we run it through there. It's just going to make it less likely to chip out. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut the ends of our tops and bottoms. And the way I've set this up is we've got a little sled. This is nothing fancy. This is very low, what do I want to say, low budget. We just kind of threw this together. And the way we did this is we set this up so we'd have three dedicated. We actually have a fourth router, but we could use it for the outside, but don't worry about that for now. We have three dedicated routers, so we've got one to do the ends, one to do the edges, and one to do the panels. So it just saves a ton of time of setup and everything. So in theory, when you get here, this should already be set up. And if you haven't used this before, I would like to go over it with you. But this is like a preview, I guess. But we're going to have our piece tight against the sled, the fence of the sled, and then we're just going to kind of hold that down and push it through. The router bit has its own little bearing on it, so we just want to make sure we're tight against the bearing. But this should all be pretty close lining up, so we're basically just running it through. But I always watch it real close, and if I see that the board maybe didn't go through square or slipped away or whatever, I'll run it. I like to run them twice just to make sure I don't do it 100% of the time. We can use this little hold down. I don't use it every time. I use it a lot with little ones, little short ones. But if I can hang on to it, here pretty easily, I don't worry about that. So. Okay, well, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to router the edges. So that's going to give a place for the panel to go into. And also when we do it on those sides, that'll give us a place that these ends we just did will go into. We got to do the ends first, because if we do the edge first and then we go and try and router that end, it's going to chip out real bad here on the end. Well, we can do something to avoid that, but the reason why we do the ends first is because we can just have a square piece of wood, which is part of that fence, to keep that from chipping out. So I still like to go ahead and start with the tops and bottoms. It really doesn't matter, but I like to start because that tells me if my cutter is lining right up with this thing that I made that comes out clean, that I know I set it up to the right height. So that's why I like to start with that. So basically, one of the most important things is you got to make sure you're setting this down on a flat surface. If there is one little chip, one little piece of wood like that, that's going to raise that up. And so then when it cuts that groove's going to be, higher than it should be. And so then when you go and put these together, instead of them fitting all perfect and flat like that, they're going to be offset. It's going to screw things up. So every single time we're going to blow that off, or keep your fingers away from the bit. We want to be 4 inches away. We want to make sure that's clean. Make sure your board's clean when we set it down. And then I like to use this push stick, and I just hook that corner on the back, and I still like use my fingers to kind of push down on it and push that through. That's kind of my system there. If we have a real long one, these aren't bad. But if we have a real long one, sometimes we'll push and push, and it's every time you can, I try and have somebody kind of help hold it against the fence for you. Just makes it way easier. Like you can do it without that, but sure does make life a lot easier. But we'll push and push until we get to the end, and then we'll start with this thing. Okay, so I'll just run these, and you can have a look. Okay, the last typical part of making the door is the panel, and we do a lot of raised panels. So this is where we do it. We used to have a smaller router bed or smaller router in here, and we ended up getting a heavier duty one, and so the way we had it mounted wouldn't work because it was a much bigger router. So that's why we have this weird top on here, but it works. And if we have a really big thing, we can put some scrap, 3/4 stuff to help support. But that's kind of why it looks funny. But it used to all be flat, bigger router. Anyway, this has a real big router bit, and because it's so big, we can't take it all off in one pass. So we have to make multiple passes. And so what we try to do is take a pretty decent load for the first few passes, like maybe 3 passes, and then we just on the last pass we try and barely take any. And so we basically have some lines on here. There's a lot of lines, but let's focus on these kind of blue lines. And so we'll start here, and we'll run all your panels all the way around, and then we'll move to here, run them all, and then move to here. Now this says stop, and we're going to go ahead and run them there. But then after that, then we'll use a straight edge to get the fence to line up with the actual bearing that's on the router bit. And so you actually run it there, but then that's when we stop and we actually line it up. So for those doors that I'm making, I'm actually using a different router bit, but I want to show you on this one because this is the one that most of the time you're going to be using. And so I just have a scrap panel, and I'm not sure how this is going to cut because the panel has a little bit of a warp in it, a little bit of a bow, but you'll get the idea, I feel like. Okay, here we go. Yeah, that panel's not going to work. Okay, well, that panel that I was going to try and use was too thick. It was actually the back cutter wasn't going to cut all the way. So anyway, I just grabbed this, but you see what we're doing. So I've got this routed in. That was my third pass. Then I'll just show you. I'll take this ruler, and I'm just going to hold it from the one fence to the other fence to the bearing on the router bit, and then I'll make my last pass. But I'm not going to do that. You get the idea. That's it. Okay. Once we've got all our door pieces routed, we're real anxious to glue. There's a few things we have to do first. When we router that, it chips out a little bit. It never gets it perfect, and so we're going to need to sand that. Now we try and get our grain direction going the right way when we router to avoid some of that chipping, but That's just how it is. And so one thing we'll do is we'll take 150 grit sandpaper, and we're just going to kind of roll the back edge. I'm just taking the corner off of that, and then the bottom edge on the front. And all it does is just kind of blend. It just if there is a little chip out, it's just going to kind of blend it. Okay, so we give that a slight roll. We're also going to sand every part of the profile. So you kind of have to make your fingers conform the sandpaper to the shape. So this profile has a little bit of a cove and then a little bit of a round over. So I'll sand that. I'll sand the top. I'll go ahead and roll that like I said. I'll sand the round over. And then I'll sand the flat edge over here. Okay, so I've got to sand all that stuff. But before I can sand it, you know, we've got a male end here, the cope end that goes into the stick end, and this is an exact profile. And so if I sand in this corner, if I sand where this piece is going to go in, it's not going to fit in all tight and beautiful. And so I need to mark where to not sand. Well, if I mark where to not sand, I might have a mark there. And so then when I go to stain, there's a mark there. So what we do is we mark where we want to stop the glue, because when we glue this, we don't want the glue squishing out into this corner. It's hard to sand, it's hard to get rid of. And so when we stop the when we glue it, we stop our glue about 1/8 of an inch short. This is the tongue that's going to go in there. We stop it about 1/8 of an inch short of that tongue, so that allows it to basically not spread the glue out into the crack. And so we're going to put that piece up there and mark that. So I'm going to mark it 1/8 of an inch back. I'm going to do this end. And then once I have one marked, I can just transfer those lines. I just butt my next one up and transfer it. You know, if this is not a door, if this is for like the side of a cabinet, you've got to keep in mind, if you've got a different top and a bottom, that you're going to have a left and a right side. You have a raised panel left side and a raised panel right side. So normally we'd make that smaller. I'm probably getting into too much detail there. When we sand, we're just going to stay about a finger away from our mark, which should put us just perfect with the with where that corner is going to be. Okay. After that's sanded, we'll sand our panel. So on our panel, this is just an MDF because it's going to be painted, but we're going to sand our profile on the panel. We might hit the back a little bit, but it's not that important. And then we're ready to glue. We're pretty close to ready. We want to make sure we do a really good job sanding. Anytime we router, we're going to burnish the wood a little bit. It kind of makes it shiny, and it also leaves mill marks. And if we don't sand those, when we go to stain it, it'll bring out the mill marks, and then it won't match our other stain. So essentially what we're doing is we're adding sanding scratches in that are the same as the sanding scratches that'll be on the tops and bottoms. And so that way when we stain it, it'll be the same color, everything will match. Once the sanding's done, we can add our spacers, and these are going to keep the panel centered. The panel's a little bit smaller, and we do that. We don't glue it in. We just make it a little bit smaller so it can float, so we can shrink and swell, and then the panels just keep it in the center. Most of the time I like to go ahead and set my clamps up so they're ready, so I don't have to screw around with that later. I've got a couple scrap boards, and they're just pretty important to keep. It does two things. It spreads your clamp pressure, but then it also prevents your clamp from denting your board. I normally take these and book match them. The two sides I get set up so they're basically opposite each other the way they're going to be, and I like to put them together to put my glue on. I've just found, as I've done this a lot of times, I've found little ways to speed things up, but also to, you know, when you're gluing, especially doors, time is not your friend. So you want to be as efficient as possible, because the longer stuff gets stuck together and not in the right position, then the harder it is going to be to move, and the weaker that joint will be. If you do get it moved into the right spot, but it's been sitting there a while, it's going to be weaker. So, when I first started, I'd just do these one at a time, and over time, I found the faster I can get it put together and lined up perfectly and all that, the easier it is. So that's why I do these two at a time. Now, if I'm doing a real big one or something like that, sometimes I change my method, but just for a regular small door, same thing with these. I like to flip them good side to good side so I can put my glue on there. And this is painted, so I've got a little bit, it's going to be a little bit forgiving if I do squeeze glue out. And I do want it to be, real, I don't want there to be any voids in there, because that sometimes can show when you're painting. And so I'm probably putting a little bit more glue on and a little bit farther, a little bit closer to the front than normally I would be. But typically, what I tell students is we're going to still try and keep the glue 1/8 of an inch away from that tongue, and we don't really put any past that. It's going to squeeze a little bit up there, so it is going to get some glue. But one thing that I've found throughout time is you really got to make sure, if it squeezes out on the back, it's not a big deal at all. Like, it's easy to sand, but the place where it's hard to sand is right in that corner. So what I don't want to do is fill this trough up that's on my good side. I don't want to fill this trough up with a lot of glue, because it'll try and squeeze out. So I put my glue, I get it on my brush, and then kind of rake it towards the back. So I get it near the front and then kind of rake the excess off the back. And I didn't mention that when I was doing the sides, but I kind of do that the same way. I'll get it on my brush and then rake it off towards the outside. I'm not saying you have to do these two pieces at a time. It just saves time, because otherwise you do one. But I will tell you, even if you don't do them 2 pieces at a time, you need to do both ends. So let's pretend I'm just going to do one. I need to go ahead and do one, or do both ends, because I don't want to have this stuck in here and start setting into place, and then I come back and have to put glue on this top side. So I want to go ahead and do both ends. Even if I don't do them both at the same time. So I get one side perfect. I'm going to go ahead and put this in. I get that side perfect. And then I grab my panel. And if this is a big complicated thing, I'll have somebody help me and just basically hold it and make sure it doesn't tip over. Because if it tips over, it's going to break. It's going to ruin your day. When I put this side in, I don't worry about getting it perfect. It's actually easier if it sticks out a little bit, and then I can pound it in. So I'm just going to get it to where it's in the panel. The panel's inside of it, and it's in there. That's all I care about. So since this side's perfect, I'm going to make this side perfect. And then this side I don't care about yet. And then I'll set that down and go ahead and put some pressure on it. Even if I need to move it, it's just handier if I have a little bit of pressure on it. So I'm going to snug that up a bit. I'm going to start squeezing this one in, and if it's still good, sometimes it slides a little bit. But if it's still good, I'm going to clamp that down. And even if it was a little bit off, I think I might go ahead and clamp it just temporarily and then deal with it later. Then, whenever I can, I like to flip this thing up and tap it down from the top. It doesn't always work out that way, but if you can do it this way, it's just easier, because sometimes you shift your whole door and it just becomes a nuisance with your clamps. So I'm going to tap this thing down and get it perfect. And I'm going to tell you, if you tap too far, it's hard to get it back out. It's a real pain. There's not a good way to bring this back out without screwing your door up. The best way to do it would be to flip your door over so we're not damaging the good side, and then to get a scrap piece of wood and put it up against this lip and then tap that to get it back out. I just try and avoid that. That's why when I go to tap this thing to get it perfect, I like to use a piece of wood. It's protecting this board, but it's also keeping that thing from accidentally going in too far. It works pretty good. Now, I will hit it with a hammer, but when I do that, I got to make sure my hammer stays flat. I've seen kids do it, and Now they're putting dents in there because they're not paying attention. But if I can smack that flat and straight, it shouldn't damage it. I mean, it can, but you can get by with that sometimes. Okay, so I got this thing in here. I'm going to make sure my clamps are parallel with this. Okay, if they're not straight, they might, if they're at an angle, they might pull it out of square. And then the other thing I do, because I know my clamp is straight, in addition to being parallel, I will say, I want to try and get this thing centered on the style. If I put a clamp way in here, that's not doing any good. But I might put a clamp in the middle. Well, we're not gluing anything in there. That panel is just floating, and so we don't need to clamp that. And if you clamp this, because there's space in there, it can actually bow your sides in. It can really screw it up. Challenging. So this one's on a square. It's 11/16 this way and 5/8 this way. So it's longer this way. So I'm going to put my clamps towards the longer side. I'm going to angle it towards the longer side. I like to start with one and see if I can get it with one. So I'm looking for a long 5/8. And I got it. Okay, so that's good. The store's all finished. Just make sure you do a good job sanding, and then make sure it's square when you glue it up, and it'll turn out good. This one's ready to dry and run through the sander. Thanks for watching.